Hello, I'm Matt Reardon, and thanks for watching this July 12th West Weather Update, brought to you by Nutrien Ag Solutions. To start today, we're just looking at a textbook image here. I thought I'd start a little bit differently. This was kind of a phenomenon, orographic lifting or mountain lifting, as these atmospheric rivers came upon California. We're kind of looking down this diagram, if you will, looking north along California. You can see the Central Valley here in the middle of the coastal mountain range here, and then the much taller Sierra Nevada range just to the east of that. Now, kind of the left side of this image we talked about quite a bit, and if you remember January and March, all the atmospheric river events we had along the west coast where they would dump quite a bit of rain along that kind of coastal mountain range right there. We saw flooding, landslides, which were typical of that area with some of these big events. As they got further to the east, it's a little bit harder to get Central Valley rainfall because you have some descending air on the backside of that coastal mountain range. But nonetheless, we were able to get enough flow and enough moisture in there to get rainfall there at times as well. And then ultimately up the Sierra Nevada range where that rising air condenses clouds, precipitation in the form of rain. If it was low enough in some of those colder systems, we had ridiculous amounts, right, of snowfall. It just felt like all winter record snowfall amounts in many of the areas in the Sierra Nevada. We saw that this year. Now, the right side of this image here, we didn't talk about very much, and that's the kind of rain shadow or the leeward side of this whole orographic lifting phenomenon here to the east of the Sierra Nevadas. As that air comes over the 15,000 foot crest of the Sierra Nevadas, it sinks and descends, and that compresses the air, it dries it out, and it heats it up. And that's what drives the whole Great Basin desert we see east of that Sierra Nevada rain shadow. Essentially, all the way over to the Colorado Front Range, in some way we see that rain shadow existing just as a result of the high elevations across the American West. Now, this phenomenon, it really extends up through Oregon into Washington, you could say all the way up into Canada, toward Alaska, and extends, all the way to the south into the southern hemisphere through South America. This is just kind of our microcosm here in California. Now, I'm bringing this up because we're kind of on the eve of a big heat wave. Temperatures are arriving across the Southwest, warm temperatures, that is. Excessive heat watches, warnings are going to be posted if they haven't already been. And there's all this talk of Death Valley, how hot temperatures are going to get. And that Death Valley is on that leeward side of this mountain range here. This air is going to come up over the Sierra Nevadas. And as it sinks into the Death Valley, the deeper or the lower that air can sink, the more it can condense and the drier it can get. And it just so happens that Death Valley, and the elevation where it's sitting, if we pull up kind of a topographic map of California, is way down here. So as you kind of go up the mountain range here in the Sierra Nevadas, you can see these kind of higher values in elevation up to, the 15,000 or 14,000 foot plus mountain range here in the southern Sierra Nevadas. There's the coastal mountain ranges we talked about that helped to capture a lot of that rainfall earlier this year. But as you go down the Sierra Nevadas, you quickly plummet into these lower valleys. And then Death Valley there, it's actually beneath sea level. So it's actually below the surface of the Pacific Ocean. And that's just more time, more descending air can get in there, it can get even hotter and drier. And it's why it's essentially the hottest place in the world in July at times when these heat waves build into the area. Now, this is looking at kind of that same area from a plane. And this is kind of right along the crest of the Sierra Nevadas. The Pacific Ocean is way over here. And as you kind of come up and over the Sierra Nevadas, that rain over winter and spring gets rained out, snowed out along the crest of the Sierra Nevadas here. But as it descends down this back side here, it warms and compresses. And that's what you see here as you get into the Owens Valley, which is just a little bit west of the Sierra Nevada. There's no precipitation. No precipitation that gets into here. Very little forest or vegetative cover just looking at this plane shot. Right, it's hard to even see a tree down in some of these valleys here. Now, they do have this river that runs south through here as a result of the snow melt that can come out of the backside here of the Sierra Nevadas. But much of that has been redistributed south in the form of drinking water for Southern California over the last century or so. So there's a lot going on here. California has, the most varied topography, I think, in the entire United States. You put it up against some other areas in the world. It plays into the fact that we get snow, we get high temperatures, record hot temperatures in some locations, and that's kind of what we're getting at as we get into this week. This is the National Weather Service NDFD, so it's looking at their forecast high temperatures as we get into this weekend. And I'm showing you Sunday, July 16th specifically, because at least right now that's looking like that's likely going to be the hottest day of the heat wave, maybe the peak of the heat wave. It's going to be a more long-lasting heat wave. Unfortunately, temperatures are already rising in some locations here, but I think Saturday and Sunday are going to be the two hottest days. And you can see And this kind of green color here, which is essentially going off the color bar that's listed down here, we're talking 120 degrees Fahrenheit plus, and the Death Valley lining up very closely. If I take you back to that elevation map, you can actually see the outline of the Death Valley in that temperature forecast here, all the way out here, Sunday, July 16th. Now, there are some of these white boxes here on the screen. What does that mean? These white boxes designate stations or cities here that are expected to reach their daily record maximum. So for that date, July 16th here. So a number of cities in the San Joaquin Valley potentially could be breaking records, at least tying them as a result of this heat wave. It's coming at the hottest time of the year, right? So if you get a heat wave, you get a big upper level ridge. We'll talk about that in a moment. In late June, early July, you're going to be pushing some of these records because that's when our temperatures are the most warm in a given year. Another thing I want to touch on as a result of this heat wave, that ridge is starting to build into the area here. But if you look into southern Arizona, something I think we've been talking about this year certainly is the weakened monsoon that we've expected. As a result of El Nino, we expected kind of a more active subtropical jet stream coming out of the Pacific. We've seen that. But if you look just to the south of Arizona, kind of right along the Mexican border, there are some clouds. We got some showers, thunderstorms, finally to talk about. We talked in the last video, the monsoon might be slowly starting to stir up. And I think we're seeing signs of that. And that relates back kind of to the phenomenon I was just talking about. In fact, if I jump all the way back to this orographic lifting here, this rain shadow desert in parts of Nevada, parts of Arizona, far southeast California, that rain shadow causes a lot of heat. I mean, we get hot temperatures. I just showed you some of the forecast for this weekend, right? And as that hot air builds in, specifically near the surface, kind of along that southwest desert, it can drive something that we call a monsoonal low. And it's really a heat low. As temperatures rise on the surface of the desert, they rise. Warm air tends to rise. And as that warm air rises, it creates a vacuum down below, which begins to create a low pressure system. And that pulls this kind of rich tropical air in from the eastern Pacific. And it can even pull it in at times from the Gulf of Mexico. And as that kind of tropical air starts to converge over this area, you can see it right here on the visible satellite imagery here. This today, we start to get some moisture and eventually some showers and thunderstorms building in. That is the American or desert Southwest monsoon. Now, it's been weakened this year because we've had this subtropical jet stream kind of flowing over the area, and that weakens that circulation as it develops. And there's kind of the schematic that we often look at. You get a low pressure system develop somewhere over here where those warm temperatures are forecast here in Death Valley right there, parts of western Arizona. Phoenix, obviously known for its high temperatures. That help pull in that tropical moisture, and then you start to strengthen the monsoon. So with this heat wave coming through, it leads me to believe that we might be talking about more monsoonal thunderstorms. Now, we're still expecting it to kind of have a slow start. We expected it this year with El Nino, a bit of a weaker start, but finally I think we're seeing it kick into gear, at least in some degree. Another thing we're watching well into the East Pacific is finally we have Tropical Storm Calvin. We talked about in the last video, the video before that, we started having some like bubbling areas of interest in the Eastern Pacific. I think last time we were looking all the way over here, kind of south of the Mexican coastline, and things were pretty disorganized. We had thunderstorms there, certainly, maybe kind of a weak, kind of broad counterclockwise flow. Well, over the last kind of 6 to 7 days, as that's shifted toward the west, it's begun to organize. You don't need me to point it out, right? I mean, there's a clear spin in the atmosphere in the low-level cloud field. Even some of these upper-level clouds, you can see something of a mid-level spin. This is kind of a well-organized system, and the National Hurricane Center has now designated it Tropical Storm Calvin. And by the appearance, you can just kind of see these kind of quintessential spiral rain bands here developing. If you look really closely, some thunderstorms trying to wrap around the eye. Just to me here, this looks like a potentially developing hurricane. So it would not surprise me over the next 24 hours if this gets designated the lowest level, so Category 1 strength hurricane. It'll retain that name, Tropical Storm Calvin. We'll be keeping an eye on this. No, direct impacts to the west coast of the United States, but they can kind of toy with the upper level ridges. And that upper level ridge is driving this heat wave. So anything that can kind of shift that around, we'll talk about this in the forecast in just a moment, is of interest to us. And then again, I say it all the time, it's just cool to watch these things spit up, especially right if they're not near land. It's neat to see these kind of slowly develop. And then eventually, if it kind of continues on this track, just off this map here is the state of Hawaii. So if this continues toward the west, don't want to say anything too definitive yet. We could see something of a weak, not even maybe a tropical storm, but a weak kind of ghost or reflection of the system impacting the state of Hawaii. Here's the official National Hurricane Center developmental forecast for Calvin here. So a storm as of today, this afternoon. They're expecting it to strengthen to Category 1 strength of the hurricane. Just looking at that last appearance, I can tell you, I think that's underway with the spiral bands, kind of the thunderstorms trying to wrap around the center there and building that critical eye wall for formation. I expect Category 1 strength pretty soon here. And then each day, what you're looking at in these kind of bubbles here, expecting kind of a slow and then quicker shift off to the west. Now, I like this plot. This is from a colleague of mine, Tomer Berg. Really neat. You can see those sea surface temperatures. We've talked about how those warm temperatures are fuel for tropical storms and hurricanes. But if those temperatures drop near the surface, this fuel, you erase it, right? So as this continues toward the west, you can actually see this kind of line here where it's going to get into some colder Pacific Ocean waters, and we'll expect pretty quick weakening after that. So if it does into next week, if it does make it all the way over to here to Hawaii, it's going to be a shell of itself. Could have some rain, could have some light winds, and we'll have to keep an eye on it in that regard. But it is kind of interesting to see it. It'll cross this kind of area of favorability into colder water, and we'll keep an eye on what the development might do after that. Now, this is the upper level height map. I wanted to show you the ridge that we're going to be talking about that's really fueling this heat wave here getting into the weekend. I'll make this valid. This is Wednesday into Thursday night. There's the upper level ridge kind of centered over the desert southwest here, maybe a little bit more over northwest Mexico. As I take this into Thursday, into Friday, now getting into Saturday, and finally into Sunday, you'll notice that upper level ridge. It was maybe centered over southern Arizona, parts of New Mexico. It's now shifted. We see these kind of height anomalies, that color bar there, pushing up into parts of California, Nevada, Oregon, and the heat is going to follow that, which is why we're thinking Saturday and Sunday, the warmest temperatures kind of in this corridor here, which is why if you remember the kind of those white daily record boxes where I showed you daily record maximum temperatures are possible in that corridor here. Death Valley certainly included in that. The Central Valley of California, Saturday, Sunday, expecting the worst of those high temperatures here. The National Weather Service, the issues and advisories have begun. The kind of pink color here, those are excessive heat warnings. That kind of dark red color here, excessive heat watches. I would expect over the coming days these to become excessive heat warnings as well. Widespread heat wave really building in, unfortunately, at the hottest time of the year for areas in western Arizona, central, southern California, parts of Nevada. This is becoming a serious situation. Anytime you're talking about record daily maximums, I think that's the case. So hot temperatures, stay inside, drink lots of water, keep the AC running if you have them, certainly limit outdoor labor, exercise, exposure if you can, all those things. And then, of course, heed the warnings of your local municipalities and the National Weather Service. Giving you a closer look at those temperatures over the next 7 days, just kind of give the kind of characteristics of this specific heat wave here. Temperatures here on Wednesday already warming up, looking at triple digits in the San Joaquin Valley, well over that in the desert southwest, further toward the south and east. As we get into Thursday, kind of coincidence with that ridge shifting to the west and toward the northwest a bit, those temperatures you'll see are going to follow that up into California proper in terms of the Central Valley, even getting into the North Valley. To the point where here on Sunday, now we have warm temperatures kind of following that ridge, if you remember, all the way up into the Willamette Valley, parts of eastern Washington, eastern Oregon, and then the Snake River Valley looking at triple digits as well. Not talking record heat there, so not quite as extreme or amplified as what we're seeing toward the south, but it's going to be a very hot weekend for much of the west, and please plan accordingly. The hottest temperatures, I think relative to average, certainly in the Central Valley, in the desert southwest. There's the Death Valley kind of going off the color bar, certainly, and the lower Colorado River Valley seeing warm temperatures as well. Something of good news, as we get into Monday, into Tuesday, the temperature kind of extremes moderate a bit. So San Joaquin Valley still over 100, but parts of the Central Valley, more toward the North Valley, cooling down a bit. Not seeing as extreme temperatures in the desert southwest, albeit not as extreme. We're still up into the triple digits, teens, and then Phoenix potentially seeing another daily record maximum there as we get into Tuesday. Now, this forecast doesn't go out into Wednesday and Thursday. I think perhaps we'll slowly start to walk back the temperatures a bit, but still on the warmer side getting into next week. If we just look here, this is the ECMWF kind of 7-day temperature anomaly forecast out through next Thursday, so July 20th. Not a huge surprise here, just looking at the forecast we just walked through. Warmer across the board, across the west, where are the values more extreme, kind of in that southern or southwest area, the Central Valley through the lower Colorado River Valley. Precipitation over that same time, not anything too significant to speak of. Feels kind of consistent. This isn't the really big rainy time of year for the western U.S. We do see Maybe some light precip moving into the Pacific Northwest, the far northwest of the Pacific Northwest as far as the U.S. is concerned on Sunday night into Monday. Not expecting anything major here. Over the next 7 days, we do see some precipitation, some showers starting to sprinkle in, I think, into Arizona and New Mexico, kind of consistent with that cloud field I just showed you to start. We're starting to get some moisture flow into the area, but I think it's going to be slow in terms of that southwest monsoon proper developing into the area. We'll keep an eye on that as we go forward. If we look and take that precipitation forecast, this from the ECMWF ensemble, goes out a bit further, all the way out now near the end of July. So this is out to July 25th, just looking at the precipitation totals starting now in the forecast as of today, all the way out through July 25th. A few things of note here. Finally, a bit more precipitation building in terms of that desert southwest monsoon, more kind of focused on elevation. So more elevation in central northern Arizona and parts of eastern Arizona. Some of these storms can help fire off kind of storms down the elevation a bit if they get strong enough and get going. So we'll be keeping an eye on that. Again, slow start to the monsoon season, but I think it is beginning in earnest, kind of along with this heat wave here, slowly getting going. And then again, just some light precipitation on the periphery here. Nothing too significant to speak of right now looking at this forecast. I'll show you some things I'm looking at. This is kind of getting out into the week 2 forecast, maybe like the July 17th to 20th timeframe. I think could be a little pivotal in terms of where we go from here. Are we going to see this kind of consistent heat wave concern all the way out through the end of July, or are we going to get a break next week? I kind of hinted at that. I thought it'd start with the jet stream level winds, kind of get us a hint of where the models are going to take those jet streams, and kind of attached to that, where are those ridges and those troughs going to be. So this is the forecast. It's the GFS ensemble jet stream forecast, valid right now here on Wednesday afternoon. There's that upper level ridge centered over Arizona and New Mexico. We looked at this. We know that's going to develop over parts of California, Nevada, and Arizona as we get into Saturday and Sunday. So there's that ridge here. The warmer temperatures kind of following that up into this area. Now, as I take this into Tuesday and Wednesday, getting out further into the forecast, now talking about 7 days plus, we've seen this kind of consistent hold on an upper level trough here. We can see that kind of U or valley in the flow. We still see that ridge over the southwest. That's kind of here over Arizona, parts of New Mexico. Okay, that would shift some of the heat more toward the east, more over parts of eastern Arizona, more over New Mexico. I think we'd still see some kind of associated warm temperatures in parts of southern California, maybe even the Central Valley, but not as extreme of a heat wave, certainly as what we're experiencing this weekend. And with the upper level flow kind of coming across the Pacific Northwest here, could even see some kind of seasonal cooler temperatures coming across the Pacific Northwest. This is one forecast. It's the GFS ensemble. We're all the way out here into Thursday, July 20th of next week. If we look at the ECMWF ensemble, I'll make that valid just at that same time here. We'll just look at July 20th. We do see kind of that similar upper level trough here, kind of pushing across that same Pacific Northwest region, more of a ridge here centered over eastern Arizona and New Mexico, so that's pretty consistent. So expecting kind of a moderation of the heat, I'll say, in parts of California, Central Valley, Southern California, Arizona and Mexico, still seeing that heat associated with that upper level ridge, probably seeing that southwest monsoon trying to develop along with that. But if I take this forecast a little bit further out here, kind of through next weekend, not this weekend, but next, you can see the ECMWF trying to park that ridge really over the same area. So parts of Arizona, parts of Southern California, maybe even getting into the Central Valley, which could keep this kind of warmer weather heat wave risk lingering. And it still has this upper level trough centered in the Gulf of Alaska. Now, the GFS, I'll flip back quickly here just to get its opinion as we go into next weekend here. Pretty similar, not as extreme, I think, in terms of the heat in California. It does have this upper level ridge in the trough, or in the Gulf of Alaska, I should say. This ridge here is still kind of parked over the four corners. This would build heat into parts of the Central Valley, but maybe not to the extreme that the ECMWF had it. Either way, getting into that kind of last week of July, that heat wave risk, I think, lingering. I will say there are some kind of nuances here. If we look at sea surface temperatures, those can have an influence on the location of those troughs and ridges. It's these colder ocean waters off the coast of California. We've been following those all year. Those tend to influence troughs in that area. And if you look in the Gulf of Alaska here, I'm kind of looking at this region here, we actually have warmer temperature anomalies pushing up into that area. So if there's any influence here, I would think with sea surface temperatures, we'd see something more of a ridging, I would think, building into this area, and perhaps even some influence on troughiness to the east of that. Now, that's not the pattern that we just looked at. In fact, we saw a big upper level trough here, kind of right over, counterintuitively over this warmer water anomaly. And then we saw a big upper level ridge kind of developing into this area, kind of ignoring almost this kind of big Pacific cold pool we've been following. So maybe something of a disagreement here in that long-term forecast, something of uncertainty to keep an eye on. The Climate Prediction Center, they're kind of leaning toward those operational models. So if we look at their 6 to 10 day outlook, we see the warmth continuing over the desert southwest, parts of eastern Arizona. Just talked about the ridge kind of shifting back over that area and that week 2 time frame. That's the forecast there on the left. So July 17th right through the 21st, really through the end of next week. And if you look on the precipitation map on the right, kind of curiously, kind of drawing my eyes, starting to see perhaps something of a timely begin to the monsoon season with that heat building into this area. Not much precip to speak of in parts of the Pacific Northwest where we have seen dryness build in, kind of keeping an eye on the drought monitor there. If you look out to the 8 to 14 day outlook, this is where I think there's quite a bit of uncertainty. So this is looking out all the way, getting close to that last week in July 19th through the 25th. Kind of how far east is that ridge going to set up? Does it try to get back over California? Again, that cold ocean water there, I think off the coast of California, is working to defend against some of these prolonged heat waves. Now, if it is defending us, it didn't save us certainly from this weekend heat wave. So I'm going back and forth a bit. I think there's uncertainty here. It really, I think, depends on that Gulf of Alaska trough. If that starts to entrench and really get developed despite the warmer ocean water anomalies here as we go through this weekend into next week, I think we're going to see some warmer temperatures lingering around through parts of California, maybe even up through Oregon, getting out through the end of July. If we see more troughiness just off the coast, even near kind of Oregon or Washington, and that inches ever so closely, we're going to push that ridge more toward maybe the front range here, and that heat will shift more toward New Mexico, maybe eastern Arizona, getting more into Texas. So the CPC, I think, seeing some of that. They're getting the monsoon kind of getting going here finally, at least ever so slightly here in southern Arizona, and shifting the heat back a bit toward the east. I don't disagree with that forecast right now, again, just kind of based on some of the ocean temperatures we looked at. But we'll keep an eye on things here as they develop. I want to jump back and take one last look. We talked about Tropical Storm Calvin at this beginning of this video, expecting that to develop into a hurricane here shortly. Had a great appearance in terms of doing that we just looked at. This is looking at the central, kind of the north central Pacific. In fact, if you look kind of at the northeast part of this graphic here, you can see Oregon and the northwest coast of California. But really in the middle here, here's the state of Hawaii, the Hawaiian Islands. This is the GFS forecast getting into Friday, now Saturday as of this week. And it's really just looking at rainfall and sea level pressures. And there is kind of the weak hurricane, Calvin, coming out of the eastern Pacific, marching its way, kind of making a beeline toward Hawaii. Now, we looked at those ocean temperatures. I mean, you could draw a line here, kind of right in here, where those colder ocean waters we were just talking about potentially influencing the pattern. Well, they're certainly going to influence the maintenance of this hurricane. We expect it to weaken pretty quickly as it gets out over those colder ocean waters. And sure enough, if we take this into Sunday, now Monday, what was a much kind of more concise hurricane or low pressure system here, with much higher rainfall values, that's weakened here. It's kind of, like I said at the beginning, a ghost or kind of a mirror or a shell of what it was, continuing to weaken over those colder ocean waters, but still bringing rain, still bringing a low pressure system, we think, to at least the windward side of Hawaii, maybe even more of the islands proper. Bringing some gusty winds potentially as well, high surf, some inclement weather to the state. This is looking, again, all the way out now, July 20th, so potentially mid to late next week. We could see the remnants of Tropical Storm or maybe even Hurricane Calvin come through Hawaii. Now, Hawaii right now is seeing some drought building into the area, not widespread drought classifications as of yet, but the forecast here from the Climate Prediction Center in terms of seasonal drought, this is expected to continue and develop, and as a result of the strengthening El Nino. So these El Nino years, we see more hurricanes, more tropical storms. If these can come up and bring, like this one's doing, precipitation to areas that are drying out, maybe not necessarily a bad thing if we can avoid some of the flooding and some of the inclement kind of heavier wind impacts. But kind of keep an eye on the water situation in California right now and seeing how some of these hurricanes might impact it. I think that's all I have for you all this evening. Thank you for watching.